Kale had always been a man who lived on the edge of the law, navigating the dark corners of the galaxy with nothing but his wits and a beat-up starship. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate or destiny, until the day he met her. It started with a job, like most things in Kale's life. A shadowy figure in a dimly lit bar on the outer rim offered him a fortune to rescue a captive princess from a luxury spaceship. The job seemed too good to be true, but Kale's ship was falling apart, and desperation had a way of clouding judgment. "Just grab the princess and get her out," the figure had said, sliding a holographic display of the payout across the table. "No guards, no security systems. She's practically gift-wrapped." Kale should have known better. In his line of work, easy money usually meant trouble. But the numbers on that display were enough to make him ignore the warning bells in his head. 6 hours later, Kale found himself creeping through the opulent corridors of a spaceship that looked more like a floating palace than a prison. The walls were lined with real wood, and crystal chandeliers floated in zero-G pods, casting rainbow patterns across the walls. "Some prison," Kale muttered under his breath, checking his wrist scanner. According to the coordinates, the princess was just beyond the next door. He pressed his palm against the biometric lock, using the copied print he'd been given. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Kale froze mid-step. The princess wasn't what he expected. She lounged on a floating chaise, her violet skin shimmering under the soft lighting. Her silver hair cascaded around her shoulders like liquid mercury, and her emerald eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. She wore a dress made of starlight, and the golden energy cuffs around her wrists seemed more like fashion accessories than restraints. "Oh, hello," she drawled, her voice like crystal wind chimes. "You must be my rescuer." Kale's hand instinctively went to his blaster, but she just laughed. "Are you planning to shoot me? That would make for a rather poor rescue, don't you think?" "I'm here to get you out," Kale said, his voice gruff. "Can we skip the commentary?" "But commenting on appearances is so much fun," she pouted, then stretched languidly. "Though I suppose if you insist on this rescue business, we should get on with it. These cuffs are starting to chafe." Something about her casual attitude set off warning bells in Kale's head, but he'd come too far to back out now. He approached cautiously, pulling out the universal key he'd been given. "Hold still," he muttered, trying to focus on the cuffs and not the way her skin seemed to pulse with an inner light. "Oh, I'm very still," she purred, leaning closer than necessary. "So capable with your hands." The cuffs clicked open with a soft chime, and for a split second, Kale could have sworn he saw a triumphant gleam in those emerald eyes. "There," he said. "Now let's." An alarm suddenly blared throughout the ship, red lights flooding the room. "Oh dear," the princess said, not sounding particularly concerned. "We should probably run now." "You think?" Kale grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. To his surprise, she moved with fluid grace, keeping perfect pace despite her elaborate dress. "Left," she called out as they reached an intersection. "The hangar bays are that way." "How do you know?" Kale started to ask, then ducked as a security drone whizzed overhead. "Less questioning, more running," she suggested, actually sounding like she was enjoying herself. They burst into the hangar bay, and Kale's eyes immediately locked onto a sleek courier ship. "Can you fly?" he asked, already heading for the ship. She laughed again. "Oh, darling, I can do so many things. But right now, I think I'll let you handle that part." The ship's security was pathetically easy to bypass, another detail that should have worried Kale if he hadn't been so focused on escape. Within minutes, they were breaking through the yacht's defensive shields and accelerating into open space. Pursuing vessels detected, the ship's AI announced calmly. "Time for some fancy flying," Kale muttered, his hands dancing across the controls. The courier ship responded beautifully, far better than his own patched-together vessel. The princess, Zenara, according to his briefing, had settled into the co-pilot's seat, watching him work with undisguised interest. "My, you are good with your hands," she commented as he executed a particularly tight spiral to avoid incoming fire. "Could you maybe flirt after we're not being shot at?" Kale snapped. "Where's the fun in that?" she said with a wicked smile. Kale punched in the coordinates for a blind jump, a dangerous move but one that would make them impossible to track. "Hold on to something, princess. This might get rough." "I love rough," she said, her smile doing dangerous things to his concentration. The stars stretched into lines around them as they made the jump. Kale allowed himself to relax slightly, turning to face his rescued passenger. "All right," he said. "Now maybe you can explain why." Zenara was stretching again, her dress shifting in ways that defied physics. "You know," she said conversationally, "for someone who just committed grand theft spaceship and kidnapped a royal, you seem remarkably calm." "Kidnapped? I rescued you." "Did you?" Those emerald eyes fixed on him with an expression that made his stomach drop. "Are you sure about that?" "You were in chains." "I was in ceremonial bonds," she corrected. "Part of a very specific ritual, actually." She leaned forward, and Kale found himself unable to look away from her gaze. "Tell me, brave rescuer, did you bother to ask why I was there? Or did you just assume?" Kale's mind raced back through the events of the past day, the too easy job, the unguarded princess, the simple security systems. "Oh no," he whispered. Zenara's smile widened. "Oh yes. You know, I really should thank you. The ritual requires someone to freely choose to remove the bonds. You did such a wonderful job playing your part." "My part in what?" She stretched one final time, and this time, Kale could have sworn he saw energy crackling around her violet skin. "You really are quite dense, aren't you?" she sighed dramatically. "Let me spell it out for you, my impulsive friend. According to the ancient laws of my people, you've just participated in a binding ceremony." Kale felt his mouth go dry. "Binding as in, marriage?" "Congratulations, darling," she said cheerfully. "We're now spiritually, legally, and," she wiggled her fingers, causing sparkles of energy to dance between them, psychically bound. For a long moment, Kale could only stare at her in horror. Then he managed to croak out, "You're joking." "I never joke about marriage," she said, then considered for a moment. "Well, rarely. Sometimes. But not about this." Kale slumped in his chair, the full weight of what he'd done crashing down on him. "I'm an idiot." Zenara beamed at him. "Yes, you are. But you're my idiot now." She reached over and patted his cheek. "Don't worry, husband. I'm sure we'll have lots of fun together." The way she said "fun" made Kale seriously consider if jumping out of the airlock might be preferable to whatever he'd just gotten himself into. The bond deepens. The luxury suite Zenara had commandeered was unlike anything Kale had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the galaxy, its swirling colors casting a soft glow across the room. Kale paced nervously, his boots clicking against the polished floor. "You still haven't explained what you meant by transformation," he said, his voice tight with frustration. Zenara lounged on a floating divan, her violet skin shimmering in the starlight. "Patience, darling," she said, her tone infuriatingly calm. "Though I must say, that display of power earlier was impressive." Kale stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What are you talking about?" "When you told those men to leave," she said, her emerald eyes gleaming with curiosity. "You didn't just say it, you commanded it. The bond is already working." Kale frowned, recalling the strange surge of energy he'd felt. "I don't understand. I'm just a human. I don't have psychic powers." "Not yet," Zenara said, standing and gliding toward him. "But you will. The ritual is designed to awaken latent abilities in the bonded partner. In time, you'll be able to do much more than command people to leave a room." Kale shook his head, running a hand through his disheveled hair. This is insane. I didn't sign up for this. You did, actually, Zanara said with a smirk. When you removed those cuffs, you accepted the terms of the ritual. There's no going back now. Kale glared at her, but before he could respond, a tingling sensation started at his wrists. He looked down to see golden energy bands materializing around them, identical to the ones he'd removed from Zanara. What the? He tried to pull them off, but his fingers passed right through them. Ah, there they are, Zanara said, clapping her hands in delight. I was wondering when the binding would manifest physically. Get these off me, Kale demanded. Can't, Zanara said, her smile widening. Well, won't. They're a symbol of our bond. Think of them as wedding rings, very elaborate, slightly restrictive wedding rings. Restrictive how? Kale asked, dreading the answer. Oh, nothing too extreme, Zanara said, waving a hand dismissively. You just can't go more than 20 meters from me without getting a rather nasty shock. And you'll feel compelled to protect me if I'm in danger. Oh, and we'll share an empathic link. Kale stared at her in disbelief. You're joking. I rarely joke about such things, Zanara said, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. Also, you might experience occasional spontaneous levitation during moments of strong emotion, but that's fairly rare. Kale slumped against the wall, feeling the weight of his new reality pressing down on him. This is insane. I'm a smuggler, not a royal consort. Former smuggler, Zanara corrected. You've moved up in the universe. As if to emphasize her point, she waved her hand, and a holographic display materialized between them. It showed news feeds from across the galaxy, all featuring headlines about their romantic union. Earthborn smuggler steals royal bride, Kale read aloud, his heart sinking. Psychic princess claims common criminal as consort. Galactic scandal, inside the shocking royal marriage. We're trending, Zanara said proudly. Father will be pleased. He always said I needed to make more headlines. Your father, Kale said weakly. The psychic emperor. One of them, Zanara said with a shrug. We're a large family. She patted his cheek, her touch sending a strange warmth through him. Don't worry. They probably won't try to execute you. Probably, Kale echoed, his voice rising. It wasn't meant to be reassuring, Zanara said, her emerald eyes sparkling with mischief. Now, shall we discuss honeymoon destinations? I'm thinking somewhere exciting, perhaps that lovely little war zone in the Orion sector. Kale stared at her in horror. War zone. Well, we have to make our first public appearance somewhere dramatic, Zanara said, twirling so her starlight dress shimmered. Besides, I've always wanted to see how these bonds work in actual combat. No, Kale said firmly. Absolutely not. I'm not going to. He took a step back and immediately felt a sharp shock run through his body. He looked down to see he'd reached the edge of their 20-meter limit. Zanara's smile turned predatory. Something wrong, husband? Stop calling me that, Kale growled. Would you prefer, my love? Darling? Sweet mortal plaything, Zanara teased, stepping closer. Kale opened his mouth to retort, but suddenly the ship's warning system blared to life. Multiple vessels approaching. Royal signatures detected. Zanara clapped her hands again. Oh, good. That'll be my honor guard. They're always so protective, she glanced at Kale. You might want to look presentable. First impressions with the family are so important. Kale looked down at his worn smuggler's clothes, then at the approaching fleet of royal vessels visible through the viewport. Their hulls gleamed with psychic energy, and he felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. I hate my life, he muttered. Now, Zanara said, sliding her arm through his. This is just the beginning of our adventure, she leaned close and whispered in his ear, and trust me, husband mine, you haven't seen anything yet. The royal ships surrounded them in a formation that looked both ceremonial and threatening. As their comm system crackled to life with what would undoubtedly be the first of many complicated explanations to Zanara's family, Kale had a sudden realization. He'd been so worried about getting caught during this job that he never considered something worse might happen, something like accidentally marrying a psychic princess with a mischievous streak and a family of reality-bending demigods. As Zanara squeezed his arm and began composing what she called their romantic first meeting story, for the galactic press, Kale made a mental note: next time someone offered him an easy job for too much money, he was going to run in the opposite direction. Assuming these bonds would let him run anywhere at all. The Galactic Storm. The royal fleet surrounded Kale and Zanara's ship like a pack of wolves circling their prey. The comm system crackled to life, and a deep, authoritative voice filled the cabin. "This is Commander Draven of the Zorathian Imperial Guard. Identify yourselves and state your business." Zanara sighed dramatically, as if this were all a minor inconvenience. "Oh, it's Draven. He's always so serious." She pressed a button on the console, and her image appeared on the holographic display. "Commander Draven," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "How lovely to hear from you. I trust Father isn't too upset." The hologram of Draven appeared, his stern face framed by a helmet adorned with psychic energy runes. "Princess Zanara," he said, his tone tight with barely restrained frustration. "Your father is concerned. And who is this human you've brought aboard?" Kale stepped into view, trying to look as confident as possible. "Name's Kale. I'm, her husband." Draven's eyes narrowed, and Kale could feel the weight of his scrutiny even through the hologram. "This is highly irregular. The council will need to be informed." "Oh, don't be such a bore, Draven," Zanara said, waving a hand dismissively. "The ritual is complete, and the bond is sealed. There's nothing the council can do about it." Draven's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that. Prepare to be boarded." The comm link cut off, and Kale turned to Zanara. "Boarded? What does that mean?" "It means," Zanara said, her emerald eyes gleaming with excitement, "that we're about to have some very unwelcome guests. But don't worry, darling. I have a plan." "A plan?" Kale repeated, his voice rising. "You just said there's nothing the council can do." "Well, technically, there isn't," Zanara said, her tone far too casual for Kale's liking. "But that doesn't mean they won't try to make our lives difficult. Now, follow my lead." Before Kale could protest, Zanara grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the ship's airlock. As they reached it, the doors hissed open, revealing a squad of heavily armed Zorathian guards. "Princess Zanara," Draven said, stepping forward. "You are to come with us immediately." "Oh, Draven," Zanara said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You know I can't do that. The bond requires me to stay with my husband." Draven's eyes flicked to Kale, and for a moment, Kale thought he saw a flicker of pity in the commander's gaze. "This human is no match for you, princess. The council will never accept him." "That's where you're wrong," Zanara said, her tone hardening. "The bond has already begun to awaken his powers. In time, he'll be every bit as powerful as any Zorathian." Kale blinked, surprised by her confidence. He hadn't felt particularly powerful since this whole ordeal began, but he wasn't about to argue in front of Draven. "Be that as it may," Draven said, his voice cold, "you are to return to Zorathia immediately. The council demands it." Zanara's eyes narrowed, and Kale felt a sudden surge of energy in the air. "I don't take orders from you, Draven. And if you try to force me, you'll regret it." The guards shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on their weapons. Draven's expression remained stoic, but Kale could see the tension in his shoulders. "Very well," Draven said after a long pause. "But know this, princess, the council will not let this go. You've made a powerful enemy today. I've made plenty of enemies, Zanara said with a smirk. One more won't make much difference. Draven turned on his heel and motioned for the guards to follow. As they retreated, Kale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That went better than expected, Zanara said, her tone light. Better than expected, Kale repeated, his voice rising. They were about to arrest us. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Zanara said, waving a hand dismissively. They were just trying to intimidate us. But they won't risk harming me, or you, for that matter. Not while the bond is still new. Kale frowned, still trying to process everything that had just happened. So what now? We just wait for them to come back with more guards. Of course not, Zanara said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. We're going to give them something else to worry about. She moved to the ship's control panel and began inputting coordinates. There's a rogue faction of aliens in the Orion sector who've been causing trouble for the Empire. If we can take them down, it'll prove to the Council that you're more than just a common criminal. And how exactly are we supposed to do that? Kale asked, his skepticism evident. With your newfound powers, of course, Zanara said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And a little help from me. Kale groaned, running a hand through his hair. This is insane. I'm not a soldier, Zanara. I'm a smuggler. Former smuggler, Zanara corrected, her tone teasing. And you're more than that now. You just don't know it yet. Before Kale could argue further, the ship's engines roared to life, and they shot into hyperspace. As the stars blurred around them, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. But as he glanced at Zanara, her violet skin glowing in the dim light of the cabin, he realized something else. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. The power within. The ship emerged from hyperspace in the Orion sector, a region of the galaxy known for its volatile conflicts and lawless factions. Kale stared out the viewport at the swirling nebulas and scattered debris fields, his stomach churning with unease. This is where we're supposed to prove ourselves, he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Exactly, Zanara said, her emerald eyes gleaming with excitement. The rogue faction here has been a thorn in the Empire's side for years. If we can take them down, it'll show the Council that you're more than just a human smuggler. And how do you propose we do that? Kale asked, crossing his arms. I don't even know how to use these so-called powers of mine. You'll learn, Zanara said, her tone confident. The bond is already working. You just need to trust it, and me. Kale sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Easier said than done. Zanara moved closer, her violet skin shimmering in the dim light. Close your eyes, she said softly. Why? Kale asked, his guard immediately up. Just do it, Zanara said, her voice firm but gentle. Reluctantly, Kale closed his eyes. He felt Zanara's hands on his shoulders, her touch sending a warm, tingling sensation through his body. Focus on the bond, she whispered. Feel the energy between us. It's part of you now. Kale tried to do as she said, though it felt strange and unnatural. At first, there was nothing but darkness. But then, slowly, he began to sense something, a faint pulse of energy, like a heartbeat in the back of his mind. That's it, Zanara said, her voice barely audible. Now, reach for it. Kale focused on the pulse, willing it to grow stronger. As he did, he felt a surge of power course through him, like electricity in his veins. His eyes snapped open, and he gasped as golden energy crackled around his hands. What the? He stared at his hands in awe, the energy dancing between his fingers. See, Zanara said, her smile radiant. You're stronger than you think. Kale flexed his fingers, the energy responding to his movements. This is incredible. And it's just the beginning, Zanara said. Now, let's put it to use. She moved to the control panel and brought up a holographic map of the sector. The rogue faction's base is here, she said, pointing to a cluster of asteroids. They've been using it as a staging ground for raids on Imperial supply lines. So we're just going to waltz in there and take them out? Kale asked, raising an eyebrow. Not exactly, Zanara said, her smile turning mischievous. We're going to give them a reason to come to us. She input a series of commands into the console, and the ship's cloaking device activated, rendering them invisible to sensors. We'll lure them out with a fake distress signal. When they come to investigate, we'll strike. Kale nodded, though he still felt uneasy. And if this doesn't work? Then we improvise, Zanara said with a shrug. But it will work. Trust me. Kale wasn't sure he did, but he didn't have much of a choice. The bond had tied their fates together, and he couldn't deny the growing connection between them. The distress signal went out, and it didn't take long for the rogue faction to respond. A small fleet of ships emerged from the asteroid cluster, their weapons armed and ready. Here they come, Zanara said, her eyes narrowing. Get ready. Kale took a deep breath, focusing on the energy within him. As the rogue ships approached, he felt a surge of power, stronger than before. Now, Zanara shouted. The ship decloaked, and Kale unleashed a burst of psychic energy, sending one of the rogue ships spiraling out of control. Zanara followed up with a precise shot from the ship's weapons, disabling another vessel. The remaining ships opened fire, but Kale and Zanara worked in perfect sync, their bond guiding their movements. Kale's powers grew stronger with each passing moment, and he began to feel a strange sense of exhilaration. You're doing great, Zanara said, her voice filled with pride. I'm starting to get the hang of this, Kale replied, a grin spreading across his face. Together, they took down the rogue ships one by one, their combined strength proving too much for the faction. As the last ship exploded in a burst of light, Kale felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. We did it, he said, breathing heavily. We did, Zanara said, her smile radiant. And you were amazing. Kale looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Bound forever. The aftermath of their victory in the Orion sector left Kale and Zanara with a rare moment of quiet. The ship drifted through the stars, the hum of the engines a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Kale sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring out at the vast expanse of space, his mind racing. You're quiet, Zanara said, breaking the silence. Something on your mind? Kale glanced at her, her violet skin glowing softly in the dim light of the cabin. Just thinking about everything that's happened. It's a lot to process. Zanara smiled, her emerald eyes filled with warmth. You've handled it better than most would. Not many humans could adapt to this life so quickly. I didn't have much of a choice, Kale said with a wry smile. Thanks to you. Oh, come now, Zanara said, her tone playful. You're not still upset about the bond, are you? Kale shook his head. No, not upset. Just, trying to figure out what it all means. For me, for us. Zanara moved closer, her presence comforting yet electrifying. It means we're bound together, Kale. Not just by the ritual, but by something deeper. Something real. Kale looked into her eyes, feeling the truth of her words. Despite the chaos and danger, there was a connection between them that went beyond the bond. It was something he couldn't explain, but he knew it was there. I think I'm starting to understand that, he said softly. Zanara reached out, her hand brushing against his. Good. Because we're about to face our biggest challenge yet. Kale frowned. What do you mean? The Council, Zanara said, her expression serious. They won't let our victory in the Orion sector go unnoticed. They'll want to see us, to test you. And if they're not convinced, they'll try to separate us. Kale's heart sank. Separate us? Can they do that? They can try, Zanara said, her voice firm. But they won't succeed. Not if we stand together. Kale nodded, determination filling him. Then we'll face them together. I'm not letting anyone tear us apart. Zenara's smile returned, brighter than ever. That's the spirit. Now, let's get ready. We're about to make history. The council chamber was a grand, imposing space, filled with Zorathian dignitaries and psychic emperors. Kale stood beside Zenara, his heart pounding as he faced the council. Princess Zenara, the head of the council said, his voice echoing through the chamber. You have brought this human before us. Explain yourself. Zenara stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. This is Kale, my bonded partner. Together, we have proven our strength and our commitment to the Empire. I ask that you recognize our bond and grant him the rights of a Zorathian consort. The council members murmured among themselves, their expressions skeptical. One of them, a tall, imposing figure with glowing blue eyes, stood. This human is unworthy, he said, his voice cold. He is a common criminal, unfit to stand beside a princess of the Zorathian Empire. Kale felt a surge of anger, but Zenara placed a calming hand on his arm. Let me handle this, she whispered. She turned to the council, her emerald eyes blazing. Kale is more than worthy. He has proven his strength, his courage, and his loyalty. The bond has awakened powers within him that rival even the greatest of our kind. To deny him is to deny the will of the ritual itself. The council fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Finally, the head of the council spoke. Very well. We will test him. If he proves himself, we will recognize your bond. Kale took a deep breath, stepping forward. I'm ready. The test was grueling, pushing Kale to his limits. But with Zenara by his side, he found strength he never knew he had. Together, they faced every challenge, their bond growing stronger with each trial. When it was over, the council stood in silence, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the head of the council spoke. Kale of Earth, you have proven yourself worthy. We recognize your bond with Princess Zenara and grant you the rights of a Zorathian consort. Kale felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He turned to Zenara, her smile radiant. We did it, he said, his voice filled with emotion. We did, Zenara replied, her eyes shining. And this is just the beginning. As they left the council chamber, hand in hand, Kale felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The bond had brought them together, but it was their love that would keep them strong. Where to now? Kale asked, a smile tugging at his lips. Wherever the stars take us, Zenara said, her voice filled with promise. Together. And as they stepped into the light of a new day, Kale knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. Bound by the stars, and bound by love. The end.